This is TruckWeight's tutorial on installing strain gauges. Strain gauges are typically installed on mechanical suspension systems, but they can also be installed on any type of axle, even if it has air suspension. I will be demonstrating how to install it on drive axles, trailer axles, and steer axles. In this photo, you will see two solid blocks, 1-inch steel blocks, pre-welded on the end of each strain gauge. These blocks are then welded onto the axle. Note that the wire that's in the center will be on the outside facing you, as in this photo, and that there's a flat edge on the bottom of the strain gauge bar, which is in the down position when mounting it. Place the batteries in the strain gauge prior to mounting, and note the sensor number on the outside of the transmitter. This number will be entered into the handheld prior to installation to check that signal is being received properly. Once you are receiving the signal and you see the reading on the handheld, you could then put the cap on, evenly tightening the screws. Please consult the manual for handheld operations, but to quickly enter the sensor number into the handheld, hold the center button and the up button down for 5 seconds. Use the up and down arrows to enter the number, and then hit the center button to return back to the main screen. The signal should check in shortly thereafter. Here is an illustration of a typical 3-axle straight truck that trucks use for logging. The same installation could apply to roll-offs, garbage trucks, and various other straight trucks. In this crude sketch, the pen is pointing at a strain gauge mounted on the left side of one of the drive axles. The bottom axle has the strain gauge on the opposite side of the axle. What's important to note is the symmetry. When you're mounting the strain gauges, they should be symmetrically installed. Same position on the axle on opposite sides. On the forward axle that represents the steer axle, you notice that that one is mounted in the center of the steer axle, and I will show later how this is installed in more detail. This type of installation suits most operations. One strain gauge per axle mounted on the opposite side. Weights must be taken on a flat level surface, which most operators can achieve. However, in some circumstances, it's not possible for the operator to find flat level ground to get an accurate reading. In this situation, it's important to install strain gauges on the left and the right of each axle as demonstrated in this image. Here is an image of a strain gauge mounted on the drive axle, the right hand side. You'll note the welding on the bottom and top of the 1-inch steel plate. Also note that the strain gauge is mounted parallel to the ground and perpendicular to the ground. This is very important when doing the mounting. First tack one side and then use a level to make sure that the position of the strain gauge is perpendicular to the ground plane and parallel to the ground plane. Further tack up the left and right side to get a firm position before putting a solid weld on the strain gauge. When welding, go back and forth to try and minimize the pull on the strain gauge. Many drive axles are not even. In these cases, simply tack the strain gauge, making sure that it's perpendicular and parallel to the ground plane. Do not overheat the strain gauge when welding, and use weld to go back and forth between the sides, minimizing the strain. Use a damp cloth to keep the center cool, and take a break between welds to prevent overheating. Here is a photo of a strain gauge welded onto a tube trailer axle. When installing on a tube trailer axle, follow the same procedures, tacking it up, and go back and forth and slowly build up the weld. Again, do not allow it to overheat. Keep the center cool. You will note on both of these installations, on the drive axle and the trailer axle, that the strain gauge is bridging the U-bolt. The strain gauge does not come in contact with the U-bolt. If the U-bolt is out too far where it is making contact with the strain gauge, then put a spacer in between the 1-inch plate steel and the axle to make sure there's clearance between the strain gauge and the U-bolt. Here is an image of a walking beam. On a walking beam suspension, the strain gauges will be mounted on the left and on the right, one on each walking beam. Note there will be no strain gauges mounted on the axles themselves. In this particular photo, the strain gauge can be welded right in the middle of the walking beam. In the blue photo, a strain gauge may be mounted on the front or rear part of the walking beam. In some cases, it can be mounted in the center by bridging the obstruction. In some cases, it cannot. Either way, what's important is that the strain gauges are mounted symmetrically. Here's how you install a strain gauge on the steer axle. You'll note that there are no 1-inch block on the end of the strain gauge. Mount the strain gauge with the wire out and the flat edge down. You'll use these clamps for fastening the strain gauge onto the I-beam. There will be 4 clamps used to install one steer axle strain gauge. The brown beam represents the I-beam on the front axle. Measure the center part of the axle and mark it. Position the strain gauge in the center and then line up the mounting clamp with the outer edge. Then line up the opposite mounting clamp on the outer edge. Use your hands to firm up and position the clamp, making sure that it is properly nested. There is a spacer provided with the steer axle installation. Use the spacer to measure out the inner bracket on both sides. Once these are in position, firmly tighten all 4 clamps using the proper torque. Once the torque is established, tighten the outer locking nut, and you're now ready to begin welding the strain gauge onto the clamps. When welding the strain gauge onto the clamps, hold the strain gauge parallel to the ground plane. Tack the strain gauge on the top and bottom of each clamp. Once they're tacked in position, then put a bead on the top and bottom of either the left 2 or the right 2 first, followed by the opposite side. Allow the strain gauge to cool. You are now ready to calibrate your truck scale. You will simply go to a scale and weigh the truck empty and loaded. Record the strain gauge readings while the truck is on the scale. Feel free to contact us and we'll be more than happy to assist you with your installation. Thank you for choosing Truckweight.